In 1983, the country has its own Black Tuesday. The bolivar crashes, and people's savings literally evaporate in a matter of days. In 1989, the government raises gasoline prices by nearly 100%. In an oil-producing country, mind you. The reaction is immediate and explosive. Mass riots erupt, going down in history as the Caracazo. Looting, barricades, soldiers in the streets, hundreds dead. As oil prices remain low, life grows steadily harsher. Society begins looking for someone to blame. Unsurprisingly, it finds the authorities. And then, in 1992, an obscure lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chávez attempts a military coup. The coup fails. Chávez is arrested. But he manages a short televised address to the country, and in it, he delivers a famous sentence: "We have not yet managed to achieve our goals."
Por ahora, los objetivos que nos planteamos no fueron logrados en la ciudad capital.
That one word, yet, sounds like a promise to return. And, as it turns out, a promise that will be kept. When Hugo Chávez finally comes to power in 1998, as legally elected president, he has in his hands a country with a whole pile of problems. And he chooses the most straightforward answer possible: handouts. The state introduces programs for selling food at fair prices, below market levels. Some of the food really does reach poor neighborhoods. Another part is stolen along the way, and yet another part is resold. For example, across the border to the Dominican Republic, where prices are higher. This is a basic economic law. Fixed prices are always followed by a black market. If you can buy cheaply in a store, because the price is set by the government, and then, having the right connections, resell under the counter at a higher price, even while breaking the law, people will do it. The result is predictable, although not for Chávez. Store shelves begin to empty. By the way, in the USSR of the 1980s, things looked exactly the same. And there is another problem at work here, the so-called Dutch disease. Every economy that trades heavily in oil or gas eventually runs into it. The mechanism is simple. Venezuela sells oil for dollars, but wages have to be paid in bolivars. Spare parts, raw materials, and services are bought on the domestic market. So dollars are sold, the national currency is bought, and the bolivar strengthens. And here comes the catch. The stronger the national currency, the less competitive everything except oil becomes. Venezuelan goods grow more expensive for foreign buyers, exports dry up, and producing anything other than oil starts making less and less sense. Domestic industry slowly withers away. Hugo Chávez tries to outsmart the laws of economics by introducing strict currency controls. The state fixes the exchange rate and personally decides who gets how many dollars. From the budget's point of view, this is great. A weak official rate means higher oil revenues once they're converted into bolivars. For business, however, it's a full-blown disaster. To buy anything abroad, you need foreign currency, and getting your hands on it becomes nearly impossible. Imports shrink, shelves empty out. An absurd situation emerges. The country has money, it has oil, but buying even the most basic goods becomes harder and harder. Do you see the problem taking shape here? Take just one indicator, manufacturing value added. It basically shows how much a country actually produces on its own. In 1995, the figure sits at about 14%. By 2005, it has crept up to 15%. That's it. 10 years, and almost no growth whatsoever. And this is happening despite the fact that oil prices surge again in the early 2000s. You might expect that flood of money to strengthen the economy. It doesn't, and that's hardly surprising. When the state subsidizes almost everything, domestic producers simply can't survive. Competing with artificially cheap goods in government-run stores is a losing game. The result is a tragic paradox. With one hand, Chávez is handing out money. With the other, he is quietly dismantling Venezuela's economy. And with that very same destructive hand, Chávez is also chasing away foreign investors. In 2006, he decides to partially nationalize foreign oil-producing companies. It's a soft nationalization. Companies are simply required to sell controlling stakes. From now on, at least 60% must belong to Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. It sounds reasonable. You want to work here, you play by our rules. The reaction is mixed. Chevron, Total, and Statoil grit their teeth, accept the new terms, and stay put. ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, on the other hand, pack their bags and leave Venezuela altogether. You might shrug and say, good riddance. But from that moment on, foreign investment in Venezuelan oil production starts to dry up. Because who exactly wants to invest billions when they know that tomorrow their assets can be taken away, even politely? And remember what we said earlier about the heavy oil of the Orinoco River Basin. The potential there is enormous. The required investments in technology are even more enormous, and now big companies are extra cautious about providing them. As a result, the single pillar holding up the entire Venezuelan economy, oil production itself, begins to slowly crumble. Output falls from 3.2 million barrels per day in 2001 to 2.6 million in 2015. And starting in 2016, the decline turns catastrophic. By the end of 2019, daily production has collapsed to just 600,000 barrels per day. At the peak of this new crisis, in 2013, Hugo Chávez dies. Let's give credit when it's due. A great many people genuinely loved him. Under Chávez, life was never dull. There were endless live broadcasts in which the president would talk to the country for hours on end, summon ministers straight into the studio, joke, scold, promise, improvise, and occasionally even read poetry. Whatever else you might say about him, boredom was never part of the package. His successor, Nicolás Maduro, had nothing remotely resembling that level of charisma, but what he did inherit were the tools of power. You see, Chávez's most important legacy was the so-called missions, parallel structures operating alongside the formal state through which people received food, medicine, housing, and jobs. Gran Mission Vivienda built cheap apartments. State-run Mercel stores sold food at fair prices. Those structures formed direct personal dependence on the leader. The logic is simple. You get access to scarce resources as long as you remain loyal. In a poor and hungry country, that translates into enormous power. So how exactly does Maduro use this power? He tries to style himself as a kind of Robin Hood. One especially revealing episode is the story of the Decazo electronics store chain. In 2013, the state accuses it of jacking up prices and profiting off ordinary people. Words quickly turn into action. The army marches in, occupies the stores, prices are slashed several times over, and citizens are quite literally invited inside to loot fairly. The crowd is ecstatic. Maduro's approval ratings jump. Simultaneously, businesses are simply wiped out. If your neighbor's store was looted yesterday with government blessing, today you will think very carefully before opening your own. Probably you won't. And yes, US sanctions certainly don't make things any easier. In 2015, Washington introduces personal sanctions targeting officials and members of the security forces. In 2017, the pressure ramps up. Access to US financial markets is restricted, and issuing new bonds is banned. By 2019, the squeeze reaches its maximum. Oil sanctions are imposed, a de facto blockade of Venezuela's entire oil industry. And now let's switch to a quick Q&A. What did the United States actually want? Most likely, to destabilize Nicolás Maduro's regime by cutting off its main source of income. And why did Maduro suddenly become unacceptable? Probably because he proved too unreliable. Hugo Chávez, for all his radically leftist rhetoric, remember his UN speech delivered right after George W. Bush, which began with, "The devil was here and it still smells of sulfur," nevertheless ensured stable oil supplies and protected business interests. Maduro didn't. Did the American plan work? Obviously, it did not. If anything, sanctions only strengthened Maduro's grip on power. As long as the elites and the security forces are paid, they remain loyal. And if the population starts protesting, that's precisely why we reserve the last oil dollars for the police. They are paid to do some bashing, and some bashing they do. On top of that, sanctions provide the perfect external enemy. Every hardship can be blamed on evil America. Empty shelves, sanctions, inflation, sanctions, blackouts. The largest one happened in 2019. You guessed it, sanctions. In this sense, the measures against Maduro backfired spectacularly. As for other examples of sanctions that didn't work, I bet you'll guess and point them out in the comments yourselves. And now, we're back to this. Do you remember the two questions we started with? The first one, how, we've more or less answered. The country has been driven into a state of extreme poverty, and even if there had been a will to resist, there was almost no capacity left to do so. And as it happens, there was no will either. The United States claims that before the helicopters were sent in, Venezuelan air defenses was suppressed. Fine, but helicopters can be brought down by much simpler means, man-portable air defense systems. And those, the Venezuelan army most certainly has. If not a single shot was fired, that points to a direct order not to resist. So was it treason? Was someone close to Maduro bribed? Possibly. But at this stage, these are minor details, because air defense system that can be bought off, literally, screams failed state. And that leaves us with the second question, why now? Hardly anyone seriously believes that this is only about fighting drugs, as Trump insists. Although, to be fair, the problem really does exist. And once again, everything comes down to geography. Coca bushes are grown primarily in neighboring Colombia, but then a logistical headache appears. How do you get the product out? Yes, Colombia has access to the Pacific Ocean, but take a look at the map. Where exactly is the stuff supposed to go next? Venezuela, by contrast, is almost perfect for this role. Reach its coastline, and from there, stuff can be easily shipped onward to Caribbean islands by light aircraft or small boats. It's an ideal transshipment hub. Then the routes split. One path leads to the United States, whose east coast is conveniently close. The other heads toward Europe. That is why Venezuela gradually turns into a key transit corridor. Cutting off this flow is, objectively speaking, not a bad idea. And not only the flow of white stuff, by the way. You do remember the sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, right? If oil can't be sold legally, it doesn't magically stop being sold. It just goes to whoever is willing to buy it at a discount and accept a certain level of risk. In this case, that means China and Russia. In January 2026, an American vessel detained the oil tanker Marinera, which had sailed from Venezuela under a Russian flag. Later, several more tankers were stopped. Allegedly, all of them were part of the so-called Shadow Fleet, a network of ships formally registered under the flags of small tropical states, but in reality, operating in Russia's interests and transporting sanctioned oil. For Trump, hitting this fleet is a perfect opportunity to give Vladimir Putin a sharp slap on the nose. Add to that the noble image of a crusader against drug trafficking, which has never harmed the electoral prospects of any American president, and the picture starts to come together. It seems that one factor with a big role here were the personal ambitions of the Orange Man. A major factor, yes, but still not the main one. Let's dig a little deeper. Remember when we talked about Venezuela's cooperation with China? The more the Americans pulled out of the Venezuelan economy, the more eagerly China stepped in to fill the gap. Between 2000 and 2023, China extended loans to Venezuela totaling around $106 billion. That makes Venezuela the fourth largest recipient of Chinese money worldwide. Over the same period, trade between the two countries increased 24-fold. Caracas receives Chinese cash, backed by future oil deliveries. Part of this money is earmarked for large infrastructure projects whose de facto owner is, unsurprisingly, the Chinese state. In other words, China isn't just lending, it is methodically buying the country. And it's concerning. The United States views China as its primary geopolitical rival, and when your main competitor digs in deeply right in your own backyard, that's not just unpleasant, it's alarming. So if you're looking for one truly convincing reason why the United States chose to strike at Venezuela's independence right now, here it is. This is a signal to China. You do not get free rein here, not in this hemisphere. The United States appears to be dusting off the good old Monroe Doctrine. Latin America is our zone of influence, and external players are not welcome. What comes next from Trump will show whether this reading is correct. So we've dealt with the less interesting questions. One remains, the one that really matters to anyone who wants to understand how the world actually works. Here is it. Why don't all countries end up like Venezuela? I mean, some absolutely do. Take the USSR. Here's a graph of oil prices. And here's the exact moment when Soviet problems begin. Many people in Russia remember that period all too well. Empty store shelves, wages paid late or not at all, the near impossibility of either buying housing or getting it from the state. Dissatisfaction spreads, and riding that wave of discontent comes Yeltsin, the first president of Russia. Then, in 1998, Russia experiences a default. The dollar exchange rate jumps from 6 rubles to 22. Citizens frantically buy up whatever they can find in stores just to park their rapidly devaluing cash somewhere. And in that very same year, on a remarkably similar wave of popular anger and disappointment, Hugo Chávez becomes president of Venezuela. The histories of the two countries are almost perfectly aligned. And yet, in some countries, this so-called resource curse seems to simply not work. Take a look at Oslo, the capital of Norway. This is the largest exporter of oil and gas in Europe. And still, Oslo is a clean, calm, thoroughly livable city. Or take Dubai, with its skyline that looks like a science fiction fever dream built almost entirely on oil money. For heaven's sake, they even reclaim palm-shaped islands from the sea. Now, yes, the political systems here could hardly be more different. And yet both countries survived both oil booms and oil busts with relative calm. Norway kept its liberal institutions intact without sliding into authoritarianism or a left-wing dictatorship. The UAE, meanwhile, managed stability without democracy. And this brings us back to the third and genuinely interesting question we flagged at the beginning. Why such a dramatic difference? Why does money earned from selling hydrocarbons in some countries actually enter the economy, do real work, and produce long-term prosperity, while in others it concentrates in the hands of a corrupt elite? We think this question deserves a separate video. What do you think? If the topic is interesting, let us know in the comments and we will do it. And when you're finished, do not forget to watch the video about the country that became the complete opposite of Venezuela. Having almost no natural resources, it at some point became the economic leader of the world. What country is it, and what is its secret? We explain it right here.